This video makes a pair with our previous video on composition of functions. If you're confident, feel free to proceed, but if not, then we recommend you watch that video first. Alright, let's begin. First, consider the function f, a to b, shown on screen. This takes 1 to beta for instance, but what if we wanted to go back to 1? We would just need to create a connection from beta to 1. Likewise for the other elements. Now, don't these connections remind you of something? Indeed, we have just defined a function g from b to a. Not only that, but if we arrange it in a slightly different way, we can see that this situation naturally looks like a composition. Recall that the composition of two functions is, by definition, a function itself. But which function goes from a to a and takes an element to itself? It's the identity function of a. Again, if you're not familiar with what identity function is, we recommend you watch our video about composition. Now, what would happen if we start the composition with g? As we can see, our f takes every element in b to itself. In other words, the composition gives the identity of b. So, if a function f has another function g such that g composed with f equals identity a and f composed with g equals identity b, then g is called the inverse of f. But we could frame it from the perspective of g just as well. We can say that f is the inverse of g. God is in his heaven. All is good in the world. Or so it would be, but we need to talk about some issues. Starting with the big one. Notice we used if. Not every function has an inverse. Consider the function f shown on screen. We can try constructing the inverse in the same way as in our first example by drawing arrows to take us back. However, if we do that, notice that an element in b will have to connect to 2 in a. In other words, this would not be a function. Well, we could actually try to cheat and connect it to only one of them. In that case, the problem is that the composition would not respect the definition of inverse as shown on screen. Functions that connect all the elements in the domain to distinct elements in the codomain are important enough that they have their own name. Injective functions. More colloquially, we refer to them as one-to-one functions as opposed to many-to-one. You may believe that this should be enough for a function to have an inverse, but consider the example of an injective function we used. The going back arrow seems to work just fine, but what should we do with the element that was never touched to begin with? We can't just leave it alone, since a function must connect every element in the domain to something in the codomain. Then our only play is to make a choice and connect it to some random element. But then, this function would not be one-to-one, which as we saw can't have an inverse. Functions that connect to everything in the codomain, in other words, where the range and codomain coincide, are known as surjective functions. These two properties are finally enough. A function f will have an inverse if and only if it is both injective and surjective. We refer to them as invertible functions. This is an existence condition. Any such function will have an inverse. But how to find a formula in the case of infinite sets is a different issue. In this case, rather than using a random letter like g for the inverse, we use f inverse to denote the inverse function. But be careful here. The -1 is not a power, by the way. The whole thing is a symbol to denote the inverse function of f. And so replacing in our definitions, we get f inverse composed with f equals identity a, and f composed with f inverse equals identity b. Since the identity function does nothing, and curriculum tends to focus on outputs rather than the functions themselves, you usually see this defining property written as shown, perhaps even shown in a single line. This is being rather lax with notation and potentially dangerous. If you're comfortable with the topic, then it's rather convenient. If you're not, then you likely misunderstand things at best or think math makes no sense at worst. Consider this small example of an invertible function. We clearly have that f inverse composed with f of 1 equals 1. If we do the composition the other way though, we can't even have 1 as an input since the domain of this composition is b. Not only is f inverse composed with f of 1 different from f composed with f inverse of 1, the latter doesn't even make sense. So what's the deal? The answer is that the usual textbook definitions assume you're working with normal real functions, so you don't usually get examples with weird sets. For instance, the functions f of x equals 2x and g of x equals x over 2 are inverses of each other, and it's indeed true that regardless of the order, they're equal to each other for all x. However, this is because the natural domains and codomains involved are both R. Even for real functions, care must be exercised though. Consider f of x equals 2 to the x from R to 0, infinity. This function is invertible, its inverse being log base 2 of x. The domain of the latter one is non-negative real numbers, so while f inverse composed with f of minus 3 equals minus 3, f composed with f inverse of minus 3 is undefined. This is why we emphasize the presence of the identity function. It makes you realize that what x could be depends on the set it belongs to. Math is a fundamentally human activity, so getting used to quirks like this is also part of it. Since we're back to the type of functions you would usually see in school, let's finish this video by mentioning how the concept of inverses is reflected in their graphs. For instance, could we tell if a function has an inverse just from its graph? Rhetorical question, as you've probably suspected the answer is yes. We have the infamous horizontal line test. If a horizontal line intersects the graph of a function at a single point for all values of the range, then that function has an inverse. To see why this works, consider a graph that can be intersected at more than 2 places by a horizontal line. The coordinates of the points encode the information about connection. Representing them with our trusty arrows, we see that 3 elements of the domain are connecting to a single one in the range. In other words, we have a many-to-one function, which as we saw implies the function has no inverse. This test may seem rather familiar to the also infamous vertical line test. Well, this is no coincidence, but to see why we will need something else, a method to find the graph of the inverse. But first, let's forget that our graph doesn't have an inverse for a second, and see how the graph would look like. There are 2 ways to go about this. First, let's look at it from the perspective of connections. By definition of what an inverse should do, our arrows should be reversed, and so the graph of f inverse would contain the points shown on the screen. While there's nothing special about these values, we can do the same with others. In general, if the coordinate x, y is on the graph of f, then the coordinate y, x will be on the graph of f inverse. Graphically speaking, this translates to a given point being reflected through the line y equals x. Doing this for all points gives us the graph of the inverse. What if we apply this to the equation of a horizontal line y equals k? We would get a vertical line x equals k. This shows the 2 tests are basically identical. The horizontal line test works because when drawing the graph of a function that fails it, we see that its inverse candidate would fail the vertical line test, meaning it's not a function. The switch in coordinates also explains the algebraic method to find the formula for the inverse. While you may have known about it already, switch x and y with each other, then solve for y. It comes down from the fact that the inverse needs to reverse the connections. We then just solve for y. You may still feel a bit uneasy since f inverse seems to take y to x, so why solve for y to find the formula? The answer is notation. The convention is to use y to represent an element in the codomain of the function and x to represent an element in the domain of the function. Since we're looking at f inverse, we follow the convention and let our variables represent elements in different sets. Using the f notation, we can make this much clearer. If we place f inverse of x inside of f in the expression for the function we have been using, we get... Well, this may seem complicated, but recalling the definition of inverses, the left side simplifies to x. Here, you can see that we effectively switched things, but that the y variable actually represented something else. F of x before the switch, and f inverse of x after it. And boom, there you have it. You're now an expert on inverses. Or maybe not quite yet. Remember that the true way to learn mathematics is to do mathematics. So give it a try with your newfound understanding. Alright, see you guys soon. This video is brought to you by Lighthouse Global, your personal online tutoring for IB, college applications, and school subjects.